I'm calling Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I rise to speak on part 2 of the government's proposed privatisation bill that's before the parliament tonight. We have a number of Green Party amendments. There's a number of amendments in my name to this bill. On the previous part, I wasn't able to get the call again to talk to some of the amendments on the truncated debate on the previous part, which was, I thought, most unfortunate that here we are debating this very serious bill in front of Parliament, but we weren't able to have sufficient debate so that you could even get a chance to talk to your amendments. But I guess that's the way this government likes to work. So I want to try to get to at least two of my amendments tonight, to talk to them. But I think that it is important that we actually have an extended debate on this bill in the House tonight, given that it is a fundamental bill, a very important part of New Zealand's assets are being privatised, and there is enormous public interest in this legislation. There's enormous public opposition, and I would really call on the government and the chair to enable maximum debate on this bill, because there is maximum interest. Now, before I talk about a couple of the amendments, it's worth countering some of the arguments of the Minister, who graced us for a few minutes with his arguments around privatisation and why it's such a good idea. And of course it was the debt argument that Mr Ryle reached for, which has of course now become the government's favourite argument around privatisation. And of course it was also the favourite argument that was used by Roger Douglas when he talked about the privatisation program. And later, as Roger Douglas admitted, it doesn't make any economic sense to use the debt argument around privatisation, but it makes political sense. And that's why the government is now trying to use the debt linked to privatisation argument. But of course in the long run it adds to government debt because it adds to the government deficit. In terms of the Minister's argument, there was a very interesting, I thought, slip of the tongue in the Minister's argument where he talked about the country's debt rather than the government's debt. Normally when the government mounts this argument they try to talk about it purely in terms of government debt, but he actually talked about it in terms of the country's debt. And of course the reality is that this privatisation program, to the extent that the shares are bought by New Zealanders, makes no contribution to New Zealand's net international investment position. The only way that it actually assists with our net international investment position, or rather in terms of debt in particular, is to the extent that there's overseas purchase of these assets. In terms of the domestic sector within New Zealand, if there's simply a transfer of these assets between the Crown and to the private sector, and then the private sector in return pays for those assets, overall the country's no better off. But when you look at the actual debt projections of the government, which of course the Minister didn't want to talk about, the net international investment position overall in the years ahead is that it gets worse. So regardless of the privatisation program that we're debating tonight, when you look at the government's actual economic forecasts, both those contained in the budget, those projected by the Reserve Bank, New Zealand's net international investment position gets worse. So when the government tells us, as the Minister did just speaking to his bill just now, that this is part of their plan to reduce debt, it is not, because their plan is to increase debt. Their plan is to increase the current account deficit. Their plan is to increase the net international debt of New Zealand, because that is in their own projections. And that is the lie to the argument around debt. I did want to talk to the amendment around the referendum. So what I've put up here is an amendment to Clause 16, which is a prohibition of disposal or issue of shares before the referendum. And the basic point of this clause, of this amendment rather, is to make sure that there is no disposal or privatisation of the shares prior to the citizen-initiated referendum either taking place or expiring the amount of time that we have to collect the signatures. Now, this has been, I think, a very important part of the democratic process of New Zealand. So on the one hand, the government says it has a mandate, even though the government didn't get a majority in the House, and as we've been seeing in the votes on the bill tonight, the vote on this bill is as close as it could possibly be. It is 61 votes to 60 on the last vote on Part 1. So the vote is as close as it could possibly be in this House. There cannot be a closer vote, a more narrow majority than 61 votes to 60, as we had on Part 1 in this House just now. And yet the government is claiming a 61 vote to 60 vote have won the narrowest possible vote as a mandate for the privatisation of assets. It is no such mandate. And what this clause, this amendment seeks to do is that if the government is so confident of their position on the privatisation of electricity companies, then to put it to Mr Chair.
Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Is to put the question, enable this process to go forward with regard to the citizen-initiated referendum. Now, this referendum gives New Zealanders the opportunity to force a referendum. Now, it's true that the referendum is not binding on the government, and we're not proposing to make it binding on the government through this amendment. But what we are saying is that what is binding on the government with this amendment is that the actual sale of the shares can't proceed until the referendum is had. Because I believe that once the referendum is actually taken place, we will find that the vast majority of New Zealanders will not support the government's privatisation program. I was told tonight about that the National Party themselves are receiving resignations from members of the National Party as a result of this privatisation program. Because amongst National Party members and voters, there is not support for the privatisation of their assets, because National Party voters understand, like the voters for all the other parties in this House, that this is a very stupid idea. And so National Party voters do not support it. That's why the polls show a majority of voters for pretty much every political party, except possibly ACT, are opposed to the privatisation. So this clause is about giving those people, ordinary mums and dad New Zealanders, mums and dads in New Zealand, and single people as well, because I don't know why the government thinks single people don't count, it's always mums and dads, but anyway, ordinary New Zealanders, why they should have that. Ordinary New Zealanders want the right to have their voice on this issue. And I would ask the government, and I would ask Peter Dunn to support this clause, because all it takes is one vote. Right? Everything on this bill is so finely balanced because there's only one vote in it. We only need one person from the other side of the House to see sense and support an amendment like this, and we can go through a process whereby there's a referendum. Now, if we're unable to collect the 350,000 signatures that we need to force a citizen-initiated referendum, then the clause would lapse, it wouldn't apply. But I am very confident that we will collect the signatures we need to do this, because New Zealanders are up in arms about this asset sale program. Now, I'd just like to talk about another part of the mixed ownership model bill. So this part 2 we're looking at the moment essentially sets up these mixed ownership model companies. Now, the thing about it is that the impact of setting it up will be that people are going to be colder. I mean, that's the truth, right? We should just admit the truth about what this means is that we're in the middle of winter, people are freezing cold all over the country, they're struggling to pay their electricity bills. What this bill really means is that mum and dad and children, New Zealanders, ordinary people, families, will be colder in upcoming winters. This winter will be okay. Well, it's still, we're still owned, but by the government. But in future winters, mum and dad New Zealander will be colder as a result of this bill. It is the you can get colder and can't afford your electricity prices bill, because that's what the establishment of these mixed ownership companies under Part 2 of this bill will effectively do by driving up power prices. That's the result of it. And of course the beneficiaries, because this government is very keen on bashing beneficiaries, but in this case the beneficiaries will be the overseas owners. So they're not very keen on bashing overseas owners who are going to be buying up a good chunk of these overseas companies. The beneficiaries who the beneficiaries of this who will be forcing up the price of electricity in New Zealand so that they can maximise their profits, which will mean that mum and dad New Zealanders can't afford to run the electric heaters in their house and keep their kids warm. The beneficiaries, the true beneficiaries of this bill that they're trying to force through the House tonight, will be the overseas owners. And that's where the protections in this bill are completely inadequate, and we'll be moving amendments around that as well. The protections that actually, they're just ridiculous. They're not going to work in terms of preventing overseas ownership of these companies. And that means the beneficiaries of this bill, the people who will earn the money as a result of this, will be the overseas investors. So here we have a bill which on the one hand trades off ordinary mums and dad New Zealanders who can't afford to buy shares in this company. They won't be buying shares in this company. Those people get colder houses and more expensive electricity bills courtesy of the National Party, the ACT Party and the United Future Party. And the beneficiaries of this bill will be the overseas owners who get to buy out all the shares in the company, because the protections in this bill are so weak. The protections in Part 2 are too weak to prevent the overseas buy-up of these companies, which we think is an absolute tragedy.
I call Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr Chair. It's my pleasure to take